Hello, everyone. Welcome to the 6th edition of the ORF Kalpana Chawla Space Policy Dialogue. Today, we are going to be, we have a very illustrious panel in front of us to discuss one of the most exciting developments for us from India, which is how do we open up the Indian space sector and what is the role of the private sector in this regard. So, in the panel with me, I have Narayan Prasad from SatSearch, I have Bidushi from Astropreneurs HUB, I have Yashas from Bellatrix, all of whom are very well-established entrepreneurs in their respective jurisdictions and sectors. And I would love to hear their thoughts on what is it that India can do now that the economy is slowly opening up. Okay, so let me begin. I think in all the conversations that we've had with people from the establishment and outside of it, one thing that we keep hearing about is we need an Indian approach. What the Americans did or what the Europeans did cannot work for us in terms of balancing the aspirations of the private sector with the Indian national interest. So what is this Indian approach and what could it be? So I want to first start by going to you, Bidushi. Since you come from a very well-developed space and entrepreneurial ecosystem, what do you think India can do to define that Indian approach to ensuring that the private sector has a place?
That's a very good question. Thank you for asking. I am coming at this from a background of 30 years in the commercial space sector with NASA, and then also, working myself in a startup for the European Space Agency as well. I think that we have to look at this in the context of India and what the assets are. And the biggest thing that India has going for it that no other country does is human capital. So I would focus on talent, jobs, and people, because there are 10 lakh graduates each year from engineering colleges in India. So that's a huge talent pool. And you might say not everybody is qualified to work in the space sector, but that's where the challenge lies, right? I have this vision of starting some kind of an education center, like, Infosys has that training center in Mysore, right? The Infosys Global Education Center. Something like that for the space sector, where you recruit large numbers of talented young people and you bring them to a location and you provide them with 3 months of training and then allow them to go out and help build out the sector, I think would be fantastic. And in fact, I think something of that nature, just maybe a different size, would be ideal. So I think that this is something that India has that other places certainly don't, which is such a large talent pool that we can easily tap.
Excellent, thank you for that. That's actually a very it's a very well refined assessment of the Indian context. NP Narayan, I come to you next. I think that was a fantastic point regarding the human capital, right? With so much of emphasis on indigenization and local content sourcing in the recent set of policies, do you think that this kind of human capital can be leveraged through a very indigenized approach, or do you think it's also important to ensure that we strike a balance between foreign direct investment and indigenization?
Yeah, just to add to what kind of Bidushi said and to your point there, I think the fundamental idea is to grow the size of the pie. And essentially the question is, how do you actually grow the size of the pie? Because if the size of the pie remains as it is, we will simply be fighting over it as more and more people want to grab a share of it, right? So the point is that we need to be able to grow the size of the pie, and that pie is local for me. And for me, the idea is that technology, especially space technology, is just another technology that actually contributes to modernizing society and developing industries across. So when you take that frame of mind, it doesn't really matter what you do as such. It's a question of which problems are we actually solving that uses space as a part of modernizing the society in India and modernizing industries across, right? So when you take that perspective, we are still starting baby steps in that sense. We still haven't really discovered or uncovered a lot of the problems that could be solved in terrestrial industries that then funnels back to eventually building satellites and launching rockets, more and more from the private sector side. So that, I think, is the discovery process that we need to undergo or undertake in the next few years. And that's what we see today as more and more people coming out and stepping into this industry, coming from backgrounds of having experience in different industries and taking up the challenge of using space and space-based platforms in either position navigation or timing, or remote sensing and earth observation, or weather, or communication, or so on, and are trying to use that to solving the problems of modernizing society in one way or the other, right? So that in itself is a huge opportunity, as I see it, because at the end of the day, there are not going to be people who will come from Europe and US to solve those problems in India, because you need a cultural understanding of the problem. You need to have a price point to performance understanding of the whole issue that is related to the country. And you need to kind of understand the social capital of the problem itself, and how you kind of go ahead and solve that using that social capital at the end. So all of that makes it very exciting for the next few years, for companies to come ahead and say that we can understand all of these things, and we can then provide solutions that match these expectations. And the fun thing about all of this is that once you do this for a country like India, you can then easily scale that to other parts of Southeast Asia or Africa or Latin America or wherever, and it becomes a much more difficult problem for somebody who is building out as a business in the US or Europe to do that against somebody who is building that out in a place like India. So, and that's true for other technologies as well. You can see that with many apps that are scaling to other countries that have started from India, and it's the same that I see as a potential for space technology as well.
Fantastic. So I think the summary of what you're saying is that if you tie space technology with terrestrial welfare goals, I think you're essentially finding ways to increase the size of the pie. Fantastic point. Yashish, I come to you next. Bellatrix is the poster child of the success story of the Indian approach, right? So what are your thoughts on, what worked for you guys being in India, and what is it that you think can be replicated for other businesses that are in the country right now looking to aspire in space?
See, at Bellatrix, we had our own set of journey where when we started out, I think both NP and Ashok knows us from the very early days. So I think the very first time we had started out, there was really not much buzz about startups or space for that matter as well in the industry side. But I mean, one thing that really worked out for us was that we took baby steps. We started out with small things. Maybe we had 20 lakhs. We were trying to do what we can do in the 20 lakhs established, and then prove that, and then try to raise more capital from there. So it was more of an organic growth, and eventually as traction also started building up, we had also been pitching with the government, pitching with ISRO, trying to work with some agencies which were helping in the policy reforms as well. So these have been like incremental growth steps, and that really worked for us, at least at the stage that we were in. But I think going forward now, the industry has opened up significantly, and the government has given a push, and probably Prime Minister is tweeting about everything that is happening in space. So this is like the best time to be in for any space company or space startup. But I think this buzz and all the push itself is not enough. What really is enough is like the vision to grow it like stage by stage, right? So break down the vision into maybe like yearly plans. Maybe what are you going to achieve in this year, next year, and like this you go on for the next 10 years and try to achieve that year by year. And for that, what really comes in as a gap is the capital. So right now we have a very huge talent pool. Of course, that is not something we can question. But there is also this startup buzz, and a lot of companies are coming in. But the problem comes in where is how many of these are going to succeed? How many are going to go big? What kind of impact these companies are going to create, right? So one thing that happens is like quality stuff gets lost in the crowd. There could be like 10 different startups doing the same thing. Which of the 10 startups are going to be like the next unicorns, or forget unicorns in terms of industry, which are going to like change the industry course in the even like in the time going forward. So there, what I really say is that we need to look at two things. One is the end customer, work very closely with the end customer, understand the requirements. I'm talking about the global customers and also the Indian ones. As NP was saying, we have to increase the Indian pie. If there are many Indian companies coming, we have to work with all of them together, try to build great solutions from India and also the global ones. And one other thing that needs to come in here is the capital. So we need to educate the investors, create more awareness in the general community. So tomorrow, maybe in 5 years, if an Indian space company wants to, not 5 years, maybe even in 2 years, if an Indian space company wants to go IPO, there should be enough people who take that bet and invest in such companies. So that is very much required. Once that is laid out, I think going forward, the plan is that we need to take some inspiration from China, for example, in manufacturing and semiconductors right now. If anybody wants to compete with China, they really can't beat that scale or beat that cost. And space, as of now in China or anywhere else, right, we are somewhat comparable. We may be like few years behind in terms of tech, but as long as we are organically building the tech and also taking that leap and taking some bold steps, we can really get there. That is where I feel India should look at.
Perfect. So the irony of this conversation is that the Indian Constitution is in fact a confluence of constitutions from across the globe. So which brings me to the next theme of today's conversation. The three of you have essentially done business in different parts of the world, right? And what I want to understand from each of you going forward is, what are the 2 or 3 takeaways from being in the US or Singapore or the European Union that you think can really work for India? And and how can it be really customized and applied in the Indian context? Bidushi, can I start this question with you?
All right. Yeah, so let me just start by just reinforcing something that Yashas just said, which is that your customer base is going to be global. I think that's absolutely true no matter where your business is situated. And in fact, for our company, we do have people from on all 7 continents, or 6 continents, I guess, where people live taking our courses. So we set up office in Singapore initially, just because, as everybody knows, it's very easy to set up a business there. It literally took me 15 minutes. I was online, put in my credit card, paid, like $45, which isn't that much in Sing dollars, and I got a registration number. Now, that is an outlier. It's certainly not that easy to set up a company in the US. It is, a lot easier. But in terms of growing the sector, one thing you absolutely need is investors. And investors need to be comfortable not just with you, your technology, your team. They need to understand the context, just the whole system that you are embedded in. And one thing that's definitely true in Singapore is there is very strong compliance. So the money will go from point A to point B no matter what, no questions ever. There's never any doubt that any money that comes in will flow to exactly where it's supposed to go. I mean, in some ways it's a hassle for a startup because you have to account for every single item that you've spent down to the nearest cent. When you file your taxes, you have accountants go through it with a fine-tooth comb. So there is effort in that, but I think what it does do is it makes investors feel very satisfied that, I can put my money in here and it's going to stay within the stream where I want it to stay. And I think in the US, there are a lot of people investing. It's not quite as structured. There's a lot more freedom to, invest in different kinds of things here. But for India, what I might suggest is figuring out how to just start a business and really treating the space sector not just sort of as an offshoot of military technology, but considering it to be a platform for providing goods and services, just like you would for any other technology, say med tech, for instance. And if you have that shift in mindset to where we can sort of separate the military and military sort of related applications from the commercial side, I think that, in addition to having, a more easy way to set up businesses, those would be really key to success.
Thank you for that. That was very illustrative. Narayan, you have been in the European space for quite some time now, and plus, I mean, your field of study has expanded to quite a few markets across the globe. What do you think are some of the key takeaways from being in Europe that you think can work well for India as well?
I mean, I would say that every region has its own set of positives and negatives. And the question is, what can we adopt at the end of the day? You look at a place like US, for example. You have like multiple institutions that entrepreneurs have to go get clearances for their space missions, right? And what we are doing in India now with IN-SPACe is very exciting because of that, because they are going to consolidate all of that in one institution. And when you look at Europe, for example, there's a different set of challenge here, which is that the pool of money that the European countries put together to ESA needs to be redistributed to those countries. So it's as if every single Indian state puts in some money, and the jobs and the investment needs to go back to those states, right? And so that makes it very, very difficult for companies as well who want to have an ambition of growing a lot. So, that has in turn effects on how companies are positioned, right? Because I know, for example, some of the companies in Europe that are small companies that have 4 different companies in 4 different European countries, because they want to get contracts from those 4 different countries, because those 4 different countries are pumping money into ESA, right? So you have these kind of challenges in Europe because of this geographical distribution of money that are coming from different sources of countries, and then contracts being then flown back to those countries because they are the ones who are investing in those countries, right? And so I would say, this is where we have a different like nature to what we are trying to do, I guess, in India. So yeah, I think we should probably just note what is difficult or different in these places. And the best model that I can see today is actually consolidation of government demand in one way or the other to be opened up to the private sector. So today, the framework that I like to think about is, how is the government benefiting by either gaining more taxes or stopping the loss of taxes using space technology? And that's an interesting framework to use to think, because at the end of the day, that is a win-win for all. It's a win for the government, it's a win for society, it's a win for companies at the end. And so if you can say that every government department, regardless of it being a federal government department or a ministry, or a state government department or a ministry, then you look at what can they actually do to either make a little bit more tax money for themselves, or save some tax money because of loss of life or property or something like that. Then you have an interesting framework to think about what can government do to expose that demand to the private sector, right? So today you have BBMP, for example, signing a MOU with ISRO to use space technology to look at construction monitoring, right? I don't see why that cannot be done by the private sector, because the incentives are there for the private sector to benefit out of that. The incentive is there for BBMP to get more taxes because of this, and the whole thing streamlines the function, and there is a win-win across the value chain for people in any case with all of that. So if we can multiply that with every jurisdiction and every department, then you have a pool of demand that is coming into play that scales a lot, right? Because at the end of the day, every region has its own issues and problems, and you're then solving them in one way or the other. And that could be very, very unique at that point of time. All you need is people coming together to identify those particular problem sets, and then opening up those projects in one way or the other, either by pilot projects or then looking at opening them as fully blown contracts that will be multi-year contracts to monitor all of these things. So I think that is one of the way forward that I see, that we can use some of the different understandings from different ecosystems to then, as I said again, grow the pie in India.
Perfect. Yashas, being an entrepreneur in India, if you have to look at success stories from different parts of the world, what is the one thing that you think the Indian policy setup can do to kind of help you take your business to the next level? Any learning from, you brought up the Chinese example, for example, right? So can you think of any one of those changes that you would like to see in India being emulated from different economies?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, Ashok. There are a few things these are things that I think all of us have probably suggested to the IN-SPACe and then the earlier draft policy bills. There are things around regulations, how easy it's going to get. Right, it should not probably take a company so much effort that probably the founder is going to say, I don't want to do it here, I'm going to move to another country and then launch from there, right? So that is one in terms of the complexities and the stringentness, or maybe how cumbersome these paperworks are. So that I really see some countries are doing really well, and I think US also, for that matter, though there are a lot of paperwork, there are set processes and there are probably professionals who have worked on that, and they're at your disposal. If you want to do that, you approach those professionals and they know everything on how to do it, and they can do that for you. So as long as you have that kind of support until a point where such maturity comes in, probably till that point, India really needs to support and handhold and help companies set up that kind of understanding of the entire process. And the other thing is also on space missions and launch vehicles, where as of now, even in the drafts, there is no clarity on limitation of liability for insurance purpose and all that. As long as there is no limitation of liability, and as long as you keep it open-ended and say if the company causes a damage of $1 billion, the company has to pay up so much, it becomes very hard for the insurance companies to give us a pricing which is similar to that in the US or Europe, for that matter, right? That becomes a competitive disadvantage. India may have a competitive advantage in terms of human power and then maybe manufacturing costs or material costs and all that. End of the day, if insurances are going to cost you much more, it really doesn't make business sense to continue doing all the part of operations here. Then companies have to look at maybe do all the manufacturing here and then launching and launch licensing and all they might have to take from another geography. That is one thing. And other thing that I also kind of look at is the ease of doing business. Say, for example, Bellatrix now has built thrusters and we need to sell to a US client or a European client. And then there are paperworks that go with it for all countries, right? For a US, there are ITAR, and which of course I think is a nightmare for US companies. But Europe, we have BAFA clearances, and there are regional things for each of the countries. Similarly, in India also, as of now, there is only SCOMET which actually looks into these kinds of regulations. And I think as IN-SPACe comes up, there could be new regulations that kind of gets rooted through IN-SPACe. At least that's what is my expectation. So once those come in, these needs to be very fast. We can't talk to a customer, get an order, and then after getting a purchase order from a customer, file for this clearance, and then the customer is waiting for the next 4 months, 5 months, and there is no clearance yet, right? So that is such bad reputation that the word spreads. They're going to say if it's an Indian company, you can't clear the regulations, but even if you're getting a worse product somewhere or even at a higher pricing, better not work with Indian companies. So that is something that we need to do it in the first attempt, right? First 2 years kind of define all this. In first 2 years, if you have screwed up and if companies have got disappointed, I don't think they're going to come back. That impression is going to stick on. So these are few of things I have on top of my mind.
Excellent. Which brings me to the next theme. In fact, now that we're talking about export control, I think we are increasingly seeing a lot of interest in military contracts when it comes to space tech, right? And obviously, a lot of businesses would also want to aspire for export markets. And sometimes there could be a conflict between these two aspirations. So just in terms of being able to help balance whatever could be a competing interest between military customer contracts and export contracts, how do you think India can strike a balance between providing Indian startups opportunity to explore the export contracts, at the same time not be compromised in their ability to service military contracts? Bidushi, I would like to start with you because obviously I think US must be an interesting experience in this regard.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting you bring that up because just earlier today I was talking to somebody at SpaceX about insurance for government contracts versus for commercial contracts. So the requirements are very different for each sector, right? With the government, the requirements are set. You can't negotiate them. You just have to work with them. And on the commercial side, there can be some room for flexibility, but then you have the whole requirement for insurance, which establishes a whole nother layer of requirements on the provider. My thinking on this has always been that we can distinguish ourselves as startups as either military suppliers or as commercial product and service providers. And we're talking about thrusters, we talk about spacecraft themselves and about software, but there's this whole realm of potential here for commercial services that I think is just up and coming, and I'm very excited about. One area, for example, is pharmaceutical development in microgravity. There's been a lot of work done on the International Space Station already, looking at protein structures and looking at testing drugs in micro-G. And once we figure out how to do this and do this cost effectively, I think this would be a wonderful and appropriate place for India to step in terms of manufacturing, because India is already the drug manufacturing capital of the world, right? It's the focal point to provide reliable and large supplies of medication for the rest of the planet. So I would like to think that we can look beyond these current constraints and just start developing processes and just ideation for this whole new potential market that I think is going to be up and coming. And if India is able to get in there first, I think, and take the lead, then in fact the country can define the direction that pharmaceutical manufacturing in space takes in the coming decades.
Excellent. Yashas, I come to you because I mean the kind of technologies that you are working with are also very defense sensitive, and you also brought up export markets as well. So very briefly, how do you think regulations can help you guys ensure that you pursue both streams of businesses?
Yeah, that is one thing that I think that probably has been in our mind for the last several months. It's not really that easy because when you're looking at building a global brand and you cannot be labeled a defense player, especially because you're in a developing nation like India, right? If you're in the US, even if you're supplying to Boeing or even Department of Defense, it really doesn't matter. But here in growing economies and especially countries where you're not signatory to nuclear supply groups and these kinds of things, right, it becomes a little more complicated. So what we look at for Bellatrix also as a global, going forward, is that we really want to hardcore separate that, right? Have a separate thing for defense and separate thing for commercial, and probably even in terms of manpower, facilities and all that, we don't want to have a mixing between that, so that they become two different organizations. So that is probably the cleanest and the safest route, right? And we don't want to end up into some sort of legal mess after 5 years, and we can't undo things that we have done in the last 5 years. And when you are also looking at global market and entering different regulations, there are complications as per each and every geography. So when you are, for example, going to the US and trying to figure out what is under ITAR, what is not under ITAR, and what can you probably because of defense applications, even the commercial businesses have this kind of impact, right? There could be certain things that can fall under ITAR after they exceed a certain power level or certain thrust level, for example, in our case. Below that kind of thrust levels or power levels, it may not come under ITAR. So the companies have to be very much conversant on that and work around those kinds of boundaries. And we also need to see maybe if Bellatrix is an Indian headquartered company and we have a US office, for example, and we need to move certain things from Bellatrix India to Bellatrix US. how do we do that safely? And can we work with some companies which are already supplying to defense there? Are there going to be Indian implications, or are there going to be US implications because we are an Indian headquarter company? So we are really working on those and breaking our heads in the last few years on that. And I mean, over a period of time, we have come through certain consensus, certain routes, and ways to go around all that. And when you are also looking at new markets, right? Sometimes in space there are new countries coming up. So some countries in Africa are coming up. UAE and Middle East is coming up. So in the beginning times, right, it's like how it happened in India. You enter these markets, and then you try to like get the initial set of contracts, and you are going to get contracts probably for 5 years, as long as you are a foreign company. And eventually, once that those countries have a bit of hold on the technology, and once they are confident that they can do certain things independently with their local industries, regulations are going to get tightened up. You are treated as a foreign country, and for defense reasons, you probably cannot continue selling, and you need to have some local presence, some 50-50 partnership, and eventually they might even ask to create local employment or local manufacturing and all that. As a company and as a global MNC, global group, you really have to have that kind of a long-term vision as to like how many years you can do this kind of business, and when is the right time to set up something locally, and how do you structure that so it is safe from all other businesses, right? I may be working with some country which does not like another country, so how does that geopolitically impact? So all these things have to be really thought about.
So technology segregation and business team segregation is one way of going about it. Excellent. In the interest of time, because we are running really close and there are many other topics that I want to explore, so I want to quickly move to the next question for Narayan. We have spoken about public procurement in the space sector, right? And we have also spoken about how, for example, conventional methods or benchmarks for governments procuring from the private sector should not be applied as is for the space sector. Just in terms of government tenders and government contracts, especially with the recent experiences of two big businesses in the US fighting over NASA contracts, your thoughts on what could be a public procurement policy in the space sector for the Indian government?
Yeah, I mean, I guess this is an interesting aspect altogether, and we might have to come up with something original for us here as well. The problem in India at this point of time is how actually the flow of contracts happen. Today, at the end of the day, unlike the US government or other places, the end users in India, especially for government contracts, don't pay for the services themselves. It's actually the Ministry of Finance that pays for everything. And the way contracts are developed is very unique in India, because at the end of the day, if Ministry of Agriculture wants to use a particular service from space, the Ministry of Agriculture is not the department that is actually paying for that particular service, unlike other places in the world. So the problem is that the Ministry of Agriculture talks to ISRO, which then consolidates all of the demand, which then tells the government of India that this is the number of satellites and rockets that need to be flown to meet this particular demand for the Ministry of Agriculture. And then the Finance Ministry clears that proposal to build those satellites. So one of the changes that needs to be done is either the end users themselves expose that demand to the private sector, where today IMD or Minister of Agriculture or Department of Defense or whoever it is exposes that demand to the private sector. In that case, it may be a bigger challenge to expose the demand, because they don't have the culture of writing contracts to the private sector by themselves, or they have to basically allow ISRO to consolidate that demand and write those contracts by themselves, which is again a bigger cultural change that needs to occur when it comes to procurement, public procurement of services. So I think this is a much larger topic in itself, and it's a very, let's say, difficult topic to deal with when it comes to procurement. So I think this will need a much more bigger cultural change to happen in the country for things to open up.
Excellent. Bidushi, coming to you, in this sector, we see the very big giants of the industry, and you also see smaller startups that are coming out with some very interesting products and services. Just being able to ensure that there's a level playing field between these two very opposite ends of the spectrum. How do you think a government public procurement policy can strike the right balance?
So there are certain contracts which at this point have to be awarded to larger companies, right? Because they're the ones that are capable. In this case, you're talking about the two companies. It was a lunar lander. And so that's what a multi-billion-dollar contract. And that, in fact, I think has to go to somebody who has the resources to do it. And the only reason I think you had this court case is because the U.S. is very litigious, and people just like to sue. And I guess when billionaires, don't like results of open bidding, they sue. But anyway, I think one of the things that I would love to see is when you offer a contract to one of these big players, you specify that X% of the work has to be handed off in a subcontract to startups, particularly startups that are headed by underrepresented people such as women and minorities, so that these are people who have previously, not gotten to be part of this level playing field. And I would just love to see that mandated. And this actually, I think, holds not just for the US, but, just in general, just across the planet, because we have all these untapped talent pools, right? And so the ones that rise to the top, they get all the attention. But there's a lot, as you were saying, there's a lot of capability out there on a smaller scale. And if we can funnel some of that money down directly, just mandate that a certain fraction has to go to these smaller companies who can play a very significant and important role. They just don't have the immediate money to do the R&D. I think that would make a lot of sense. And again, remember, we're talking about global customers. So I would love to see the money go globally instead of just keeping it in-house in country. That would make it go so much faster.
Perfect. That was a very interesting food for thought, something for us to think about as well. So we are almost at the end of the session. So I will quickly open the floor for concluding remarks. So we have around 5 minutes left. So let me start with Yashish, and then we will move across. Yashish, your concluding remarks on the Indian space context for private sector.
So Ashok, the way I see it, right, as I can kind of sum up some of the points from the entire discussion, what everybody pointed out. What really we need to have here is this kind of brainstorming should be very often, and probably founders should not just take part but also hear to these kinds of discussions, and that is really food for thought for them to come up with the right strategy and the right vision. And the goal, in my view, is to probably establish a company that is sustainable. It is not about becoming a unicorn or raising your valuation to a certain limit. It is about building great products and building products that can kind of change the way industry is working in the next few years, so that, in 10-15 years, it is your product that is driving the industry. So that, I really feel, should be the goal for every company which is trying to build something out of here. And we also need to constantly come back to the ground and look at where the ground realities are versus where the plan things were actually heading at, right? If things are not moving out, either we tone down the plan for the immediate 1-2 years, or otherwise probably look at different strategies to make sure that is happening. And I also see a lot of potential in collaborations between big companies and the smaller companies. Like Bidushi was saying, when there are multi-billion-dollar contracts being awarded, it becomes very tough for agency, right? If, for example, in ISRO, if you want to award 1,000 crore contract, it becomes very tough on the person signing that paper to give it to a company which has not done a single crore of revenue. And suddenly you flood in 1,000 crore of revenue. How does such a small startup scale up and immediately bring in every single capability required to execute such contracts? So that is really a challenge. Sometimes startups feel that they can take on this thing, but I think from my experience in last few years also, it is not really that easy to scale immediately. You won't get the right resources and all that. So this kind of collaboration between a very big major and a small startup is really, that is something that's going to help. And in that way, in fact, just last month, Bellatrix also signed up with L&T, where we want to work on some potential technologies where such kind of synergies can come in, where they can bring in the capital power and we can bring in the knowledge power. And of course, we can also work together and come up with something good. So I think these kinds of things really companies need to keep in mind.
Perfect. Narayan, over to you.
Yeah, for me, I think taking a, let's say, 10-year-long perspective, we already have solved a lot of problems when it comes to companies. So 10 years ago, there was no investor in India interested in space. Today, there's lots of investment interest in space. 10 years ago, nobody cared about space startups as such. And today you speak of, IN-SPACe and all of these other things that are actually happening to support these changes, right? So we have come a long way. For me, I think the next few years are critical in terms of seeing some of the companies succeed. I guess that's the critical factor for investors to continue investing, for foreign capital to flow more freely into the country, and for government to also encourage the sector, because at the end of the day, the government cares about taxes and jobs and other things, and all of this is connected to then the success of these companies being able to take off at the end. So I think we have like a critical mass of companies that are good to get us started in this direction. Now I guess the question is, are all of these companies able to come up and sustain themselves in to then build the next phase of growth for many more to come.
Perfect. Bidushi, I'll let you have the last word. So your concluding remarks for the theme today.
All right, well, thanks. Just to build upon what Narayan just said, we are at a very critical time in terms of space technology development right now. There are many countries coming on board, including people, nations, and teams that are not traditional. So the way I look at this, we really have to accelerate growth on a global scale, and India has a great advantage in this. So I would say there has to be a twofold approach. One is to provide financing to startups who have very good ideas that just need to be implemented to help the entire sector grow. And that can be done either through trickle-down grants from larger contracts or through investors just coming in and being able to easily invest in companies in India. And I think the other thing, as the sector starts to grow, is to really be able to adequately feed it with knowledgeable, trained engineers and people from all other sectors as well, right? We're no longer just in need of space nerds like myself. We need people from the laws we've talked about, business, and so on and so forth. So we need to get all these people on board while we adequately keep funding the private side, particularly the smaller companies. That would be my take.
Perfect. Thank you, everyone. I think that was a very, very insightful discussion that we have had, and the perspectives, I think, certainly enriched my understanding of the subject significantly better today. And I think there is a lot of food for thought for regulators as well to kind of digest some of this and see what kind of policy changes can be made accordingly. So I thank each of you for taking the time out and joining us and sharing your thoughts as candidly. And I think that brings us to the end of the session today. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.